So, Renato, now that three lawyers have pleaded guilty in the Georgia case, are these the nails in the coffin for Trump?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet. So, Asha, very interesting to have these guilty pleas of Kenneth Chesebro and Sidney Powell. There's obviously we have Jenna Ellis now as well. We're recording this on Tuesday. We have, by the way, received your comments. We're considering how we can try to change our recording schedule to capture instant news events. But nonetheless, got a lot to talk about today. I will say the one thing that I would the way I would look at this, and maybe it's different than the way other people are, is to me, this is the end point of the gambit that Kenneth Chesebro launched, that ultimately Sidney Powell grafted onto, of having a speedy trial, which I said at the time, as a tactician, I admired, trying to rush the DA to the trial. I think it's fair to say it didn't really work. I mean, I think these are reasonably good deals for the attorneys because they don't go to prison, and that's why they took them. But in the end of the day, this is not where they wanted to be, obviously.
Yeah, so let's unpack their plea deals. And what you're saying is that Chesebro requested the speedy trial in a way to call DA Fani Willis's bluff. Is that what you're sort of saying? Like, okay, then get yourself ready.
That's the ideal. If she's not ready at all, like, you've got maximal advantage, you put a lot of leverage on her.
Sure.
But the backup plan, though, is at the very least you're putting leverage because she does not want to show her cards in a first trial and give Trump a preview of the evidence. And so, plus, you don't want to be at a trial with Trump where Trump's pointing the finger at you. So this is still probably a better result than he would have gotten if he just sat around and waited to have a joint trial with Trump.
Right. Also, I'm curious, though, once Sidney Powell pleaded guilty, Chesebro was back in a slightly more advantageous position in the sense that, he didn't want to be going to trial with her. And without her, he was, I think, planning to make the argument that, hey, I just came up with this legal argument, right? That got shot down in terms of the memoranda that he was writing, and the communications as were going to be admissible and subject to the crime fraud exception for attorney-client privilege. So maybe he was seeing this as not a good sign for where it was going to go. But all things considered, for the defendants, in some ways, he had maybe the most plausible sort of defense going in, it seems like.
I think the lawyers in general were in a reasonably good position compared to some of the other defendants, because they're able to just say, look, I'm a lawyer. I had ideas. That's what I do. I discuss various ideas with clients. I'm not responsible for all the crazy things that they do to implement them. And by the way, if they thought that I was advising them to commit fraud, they were very mistaken. I mean, that's often the case of how this comes out. Asha, one example in parallel we've drawn in the past is the Sam Bankman-Fried trial. That is ongoing, by the way, right now. The general counsel of FTX testified, and he got a non-prosecution agreement. And what did he say? I had nothing to do with this. I had no idea that they were committing fraud. And that's usually what the attorneys say. So it's not crazy that they would do it. The problem for Chesebro, whatever his name is the emails where he's like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't call them fake electors, right? Or that sort of thing. Like some of the salty emails that he had that were going to be a problem.
Right. So let's unpack the actual deals they got, because they feel really lenient.
They're also thin.
Yeah, and I realize that these are first-time offenders, and so there's an extent to which their sentencing they're going to benefit from that in the sentencing. So Sidney Powell, for example, pled guilty to 6 misdemeanors, and received only probation and a fine. She had to write an apology letter. She, to me, I was a little bit stunned by that because she was a major player in the Fulton County indictment. She's implicated in this whole scheme to hack into the voting machines in Coffee County under this claim that, they were going to find evidence of voter fraud. They illegally, tried to get those voting machines to prove that. That seems like hacking seems like a pretty bad thing. And she was also elsewhere, of course, very involved in bringing these false claims in front of courts. I mean, she's been sanctioned in Michigan for that.
Right.
So I don't know, I was surprised that she got off that easy. And especially because I'm curious what you think she has to provide, because even if she was one of these inner circle players who could testify against Trump or others, she's a kookpot and she's lied. I mean, she's been sanctioned for lying. She's actually named in the Dominion voting systems lawsuit. They're suing her for lying and defamation. So how valuable of a witness could she possibly be to warrant that kind of a deal?
So a couple of things. I mean, first of all, these are really two separate issues. So I think the let's put her cooperation aside because I think that's really important, and that's why I said these agreements are thin. That I think is important to get to as well. But just focusing on the punishment for a second, I was less surprised than you for a couple of reasons. So first of all, one thing all good prosecutors know. And there are prosecutors who don't know this, but they often are bad. Okay. I face sometimes prosecutors where I'm like, what are you doing? Is you have to realize you have to pick your battles and draw kind of a circle around the people you actually want to get, because you learn very quickly. I learned some tough lessons as a junior prosecutor that you can run yourself ragged on any case trying to chase down everybody. And so when you look at a case like this, if you're a prosecutor, you have to draw a circle around a certain group of people and be like, these are the people we really want to get. And that happens in every case. In that case I just mentioned you, that SBF case, they're like, okay, the general counsel, that's going to be too hard. But let's just use them on our side, right? And get the people that we can get, these chief executives. Here, Jack Smith has done that, at least so thus far in DC, right? He's like, I'm going after Trump. Okay, we're going to go quickly and we're going to focus on that, and the rest of these people, whatever. It may be, I mean, he set it up so he could indict the Sidney Powells of the world and Rudy Giuliani's of the world. But I think, and you and I have discussed this in the past, he wrote out Mark Meadows, and that's even less of a punishment, right? It's not only does Mark Meadows, let's say you have a misdemeanor here you're talking about for Powell, Mark Meadows doesn't get charged at all by Smith, which is amazing. That's the best deal ever, is to be characterized or described as a witness as opposed to a target or subject of an investigation. So, Fani Willis took a different approach. She did charge more people, but in the end, she had to make a decision, like in terms of how confident she was and how many resources she wanted to expend here. Like, how hard is she really going to want to do a whole separate trial of Kenneth Chesebro and Sidney Powell? And what would that achieve? And there'd be downsides because it would give this preview that I talked about earlier. So I think that was definitely part of what was going on, is how worth it is it to go after these people? I also think that for a defendant who's a lawyer, getting any conviction is a big deal because it just dramatically changes the rest of their life. And it's like that for doctors as well when I've tried and convicted doctors. But for lawyers, and I did prosecute and convict a lawyer. It was very challenging. One of the hardest trials I ever did in my life was convicting a lawyer. And for him, it changed his life, right? Even putting aside the fact that he served some prison time, which, these people won't, I still think it's impactful. So I think from my perspective, I wasn't shocked by the punishment. And I can see why the DA has bigger fish to fry.
So you're saying she just wants to get to the main event, in other words, and Kenneth Chesebro and Sidney Powell for her are not the main event. And which brings me to a question, and we'll get to the cooperation in a second, but I'm curious what you think of this. So this trial was going to take like 4 months. Like, she was going to have to present the whole kit and caboodle, right?
Right.
And so, and that...
Because she charged them with RICO and everything,
charged
right?
them with RICO.
I mean, she charged them with all the stuff. She'd have to do the same trial twice.
Yes, exactly. And so the other defendants, in some ways, got a benefit of having their possible trial date pushed back because she's, her office was going to have to present this whole case over 4 months and then, then redo it, I guess, for all the other defendants. So now that these two are off the table, Powell and Chesebro, are we going to potentially see a Fulton County prosecution go first in this whole lineup?
That's interesting. I don't think so. I think the trial date is what it is. I mean, that could always change, but I don't see the judge moving up a trial date. It's also the most complicated case with the most defendants. I mean, that's what she chose to do. One thing that you're really seeing here is the difference, and I think this will help bleed into the other topic that we're talking about with cooperation, is the difference between federal and state prosecutors. And, here you have a state prosecution. It's a little cumbersome, right? It's all these different counts and all these different defendants. And you and I talked about, it did a nice comparative, I think, a number of weeks ago between, let's say, what Jack Smith did on the January 6th case versus what Fani Willis did. And I guess from my perspective, this is the sort of trial that's unwieldy. And making any move is just challenging with all these lawyers' calendars and all these defendants' calendars. I don't see a judge moving this. And there's a lot of things that can come up between now and then that could potentially even postpone that trial. So I think the bet is always on Fulton County being the last trial. Although I suppose Judge Cannon, can throw a wrench in the works in terms of Mar-a-Lago, right? She always can do something to delay on that end.
Yeah, well, that's my thought, is that she's helping Trump kick the can down the road in that case. And the January 6th case, which we'll talk about in the next segment, may end up with a major legal issue on appeal, which might push it back. So to me, I'm just like, if this isn't going to get moved up, and I would think that a judge who had cleared the docket, with the idea that this trial was going to take place, may want to be efficient, since that time is kind of already there. Of course, he has to take into account, as you said, the other lawyer schedules and making sure they have time to prepare. I'm actually worried whether any of these are going to go to trial then with ample time before the next election.
When we've talked about this in the past, I said that there was a real chance for the January 6th trial to go before the election because the judge, Tanya Chutkan, is so motivated to make that happen. The rest of them I never was optimistic on. I suppose the Manhattan case, which we kind of forget about because, whatever, okay, compared to some of these other ones. I think any objective person looking at them has to put that in its own category. Maybe that, since it was charged so early in the game. But otherwise, I don't see these happening. The January 6th one is the possibility of we'll talk about that in a bit about when that occurs, but I never expected Fulton County to go forward before the election. I always thought that was unrealistic.
Okay, well, we'll see what happens. Now talk to me about cooperation and what you think, because I'm really curious what these people could possibly be giving of value.
Yeah, I mean, look, they are supposedly cooperators, but one thing we talked a moment ago about the difference between federal and state prosecutions. There is a difference between the quality and the amount of resources that federal law enforcement has. It's just the reality of things. State prosecutors, they don't have the luxury of pick and choosing their cases. Somebody is assaulted or murdered or raped or anything in Fulton County, Fani Willis has to deal with that, whereas federal prosecutors can be like, "Oh, we'll let the state handle this." She doesn't have that luxury of deciding she doesn't want to deal with the case. So they're churning through a lot more volume than a federal prosecutor, and I'm sure you could see that from the look of these cooperation agreements themselves. Right? They were pretty thin. There wasn't a lot of detail there. Not, they're almost like a checkbox element to a lot of state court criminal proceedings. It's more like going to McDonald's versus going to Michelin star restaurant. Okay. You're going to something that's more efficient, more fat, it's moving quickly. There's less procedure involved and so on. Not that saying that's constitutionally deficient, but that's just the reality of things. So I want to compare it to give some context to what a cooperation deal looks like in a federal case, because I think that that's what a lot of our listeners are thinking of. They're thinking of the cooperators, let's say, in the Mueller investigation or something, right? Where there's this whole plea agreement spelling out in detail exactly what the person's admitting to, exactly what they're going to say under oath that they did. It's all sworn in front of a judge, and they're essentially affirming that under oath on the record. And the U.S. Attorney's Office postponed sentencing until after their cooperation, so they have this like sword of Damocles hanging over the person's head. If they suddenly change their mind, then they're not going to get that sentence. There's just not that level of robustness to these plea agreements where they said some stuff. Supposedly, I'm told that there's an audio proffer out there somewhere, but that they could maybe they chose their words carefully and they'll change them later on. It's just it's harder to see the enforcement mechanism here and the robustness of exactly what they're going to offer. And so I think I think it raised some eyebrows when Kenneth Chesebro's lawyer went on the Katie Fang show on MSNBC and basically was like, yeah, we're still on Team Trump. We're all good. And I think that, the reality of the situation is, at the end of the day, Chesebro is not going to be on Trump's team. He's not going to be saying things that are helpful to Trump. But they're going to be able to split hairs in a way that a cooperator for Jack Smith, like those gentlemen down in Florida who flipped, are not going to be able to do. So, is this a cause for celebration if you're rooting for Donald Trump's conviction? Well, yeah, I mean, having people plead guilty to crimes is a significant thing. We just had Jenna Ellis, plead. It's another domino going. And I'll just say I personally appreciate that one, partly because I actually followed her on Twitter and would watch her falsehoods. But I also was in a Twitter Spaces with her one time where we were doing kind of mini debate, and she's like spewing all this falsehoods and.
Oh, I debated her many times back when Chris Cuomo had his show on CNN on Cuomo's Court.
Oh, God.
And oh my gosh, it was insane because she would just make up stuff. And, you're not even debating the same set of facts. And, and then she would insult me on Twitter.
Yeah, I mean,
there are no tears being shed for her.
No, I mean, she's somebody who sort of like didn't have much legal experience, was totally in over her head, not very talented as a lawyer. It's like very apparent that, she's somebody who you couldn't, reputable law firms wouldn't hire her or something. But now, she was sort of thrust into this role and given this importance of being the president's lawyer on a major, major case, right? Perhaps one of the most important representations in U.S. history, and was just totally not up to that and was totally dishonest and willing to say and do anything. So no, not only no tears shed, like this is the right result here. But at the end of the day, all these people are going to get slaps in the wrist. I guess what I view it as the interesting takeaway here is going to be what dominoes fall from here. Does this really lead to a Rudy Giuliani packing up his bags? Somebody who had direct communications with Trump, who could say, Trump told me this, Trump told me that, versus Jenna Ellis, who's along for the ride. And that, I think, is a big question.
Yeah, and what about the issue of their credibility? I mean, I'm sorry, but Kenneth Chesebro, maybe. I don't know. He has obviously been dishonest, but he's not to the degree that Sidney Powell has been. I mean, she's just actually, she makes no sense. She spouted QAnon theories. I don't know how she's really useful. I mean, she could just basically say anything. How would you know whether it's like some hallucination or, lie or like the alternate
Right.
reality in which she lives? I feel like it would be very easy as a defense lawyer to impeach her.
Yeah. I mean, she's basically been willing to say anything. She's a liar. I mean, so is Jen Ellis, right? These are just like liars, charlatans. Sidney Powell, I actually had some credentials, unlike Ellis, but I mean, she's just a kook crackpot. As for Chesbro, I think he has much more value. And I did read, I think, somewhere that his plea agreement includes some provision that he'll cooperate with Smith. I mean, Chesbro was a real lawyer, and that in some ways makes it more evil, right? Because he should have known better. But I think he would potentially come off better. But I guess from my perspective, if this is always going to be a bad thing for Trump. It's always bad when you have more people saying, yes, I committed crimes who are associated with him or whatever. It's not a good thing for him. But at the end of the day, there are challenges here. And one of them is that he had some attorneys, including some highly credentialed attorneys like John Eastman and Jeffrey Clark and so on, advising him to do illegal things. And that's a problem. That's a challenge that both Smith and Fani Willis have to deal with. And I have always said that. And I think that anyone who thinks that isn't going to be an issue at trial is kidding themselves.
Yeah. And they'll be able to speak to the fact that he knew what they were doing was illegal.
That's what the cooperation is going to matter for. In other words, I really don't believe that Fani Willis is going to put Kenneth Chesebro up to the stand and knowing, that he's going to say, oh yeah, Trump had no idea or whatever. The most that those people can do is say, I never talked to Trump myself, something like that. Maybe Kenneth Chesebro never did. I have no idea. I mean, Giuliani certainly did, but maybe Chesebro or Jenna Ellis never really spoke much to Trump other than hello and goodbye. And they'll be able to say, I don't know, but I was a criminal and this was a criminal scheme. And, I acknowledge that, which still is not great for Trump. But Trump's going to blame the lawyers regardless of what happened. And I think from a perspective of a Fani Willis perspective, getting convictions is a win because it vindicates her prosecution. I mean, the big problem for Fani Willis is if people challenged her and won and she looked like an idiot, like she totally fell flat on her face. So far she's had 4 defendants, I think it is, plead guilty, right? Because she had one of the electors plead guilty as well. She's got some wins under her belt, and some of the big fish are still yet to come. I mean, things are looking up for the prosecution of Fani Willis.
Right, and then she also has now the advantage of not having previewed her case for the remaining defendants, including Trump.
Right. That's huge. And like I said, I viewed this, like I said, from the very beginning when we started this conversation, I view this through that lens. Like the prosecutor is put in a situation. There's a gambit that was kind of thrown. They threw the gauntlet down to try to have a speedy trial. That puts the prosecutor in a position. They have to make a tough choice. It's like a poker hand when you're putting in a lot of chips. You're forcing the other person to make a choice. The prosecution made a choice. They cut a deal. They got convictions, which is a win for them. Conviction's a win. The defendants, they got no prison time, so be it. But they're going to be pointing the finger at the others. And you know what? She's sending a message, I'd say, to all these other defendants, because she, there's this element where she it was like a shotgun blast. Like she just, she's charging all these different people. She's sending a message to them. If you come in early, I'm not unreasonable. And right. If you're Rudy Giuliani and you're staring at a lot of debt and you've already lost your reputation and you don't want to go to prison, I mean, that's got to look quite appealing.
Yeah. Though I would hope that she would consider him one of the big fish that she's trying to get.
It's always a risk-reward trade-off. Yes. I mean, a lot of prosecutors, let's say my former office has standards of what they typically give people. So if you cooperate and create a whole new case, let's say we have United States versus Asha Rangappa, and you give them me, and you flip on me, and they create a whole separate case, United States versus Mariotti. Well, then you get 50% off the low end of the guidelines is your recommendation. And if we're charged together
Yeah.
and I flip first on you or you flip first on me, then it's like 33% off. That's roughly what they do. But offices generally have guidelines. State prosecutors often have way more discretion. And at least in my state, I live in Illinois, they can essentially they recommend sentences up front, and the judge kind of tells the parties, yeah, I'll go with that if you guys do this deal. The defendants have a preview of what the sentence is, whereas in federal court, they do not. And so here, there's a deal that was worked out. They have all this flexibility. They're like, okay, we're going to recommend a non-custodial sentence. That's huge. I mean, if you're a criminal defense attorney, how do you tell your client not to take that when they're charged with all these felonies like RICO and stuff? Like it's a no-brainer. So it's a win-win. And I think for a Giuliani, and if you're Willis, like you want to get ultimately what matters is for her is whether she convicts some of the biggest fish there like Trump. If Giuliani is like, I will take the stand and testify that Trump told me XYZ ABC, could be an interesting choice for her to have to make.
Well, we'll see how many more people drop.
Indeed.
So, back in D.C., Jack Smith just filed a response to an argument that Trump is making that he has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution.
Yeah, we talked about unlimited power before. This is the truest sense of unlimited power, right? You're the president and you can't be charged with anything. It's almost reminds me of that old Nixon saying, right? If the president did it, then it's not illegal, right? That's the idea.
Right. Now, the argument that Trump is making, and he's making this as a motion to dismiss, he's basically saying, you can't even do this. And what he's trying to do is extend the reasoning of a 1982 case called Nixon versus Fitzgerald, which says that former presidents can't be held civilly liable for actions that are within the outer perimeter of their presidential authority. In other words, they can't be sued for civil damages for that.
Sure.
So if you look at Article 2 of the Constitution, if there's something that is, in that hazy space,
right,
that is linked to some type of official duty, they can't be sued. And what Trump is trying to say is that type of immunity should also extend to criminal liability if any of the actions take place in the outer perimeter of presidential authority. And key here is they argue that, again, relying on this other case in the civil context, you can't look into the motives of what the president was doing. You can only look at sort of the actions they were taking. And what was Trump doing? He was giving speeches, and
sure.
He was
not the content of the speeches, of course. Yeah.
Right, exactly. He was communicating with legislators. He was, consulting with state officials on public policy issues. And you can't look at why he was doing that. It's just that it's a little bit kind of similar to the argument that Mark Meadows made in his immunity argument. Like, I was just making phone calls. That's what a chief of staff does.
Sure.
And this is the best part, is that Trump's motion compares his actions related to January 6th, especially the speech making, to George Washington's farewell address.
Oh, my.
And Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg
Wow.
address.
I was about to joke. The Gettysburg Address, too. Okay, that's great.
Yes, they mentioned this. And so what he's basically trying to do is, if you could abstract a president's activity that much without looking at anything that is going through their mind or the purpose or the goal, and then claim that as a shield from criminal liability, pretty much then Nixon's maxim that if the president does it, it's not illegal becomes a reality. And this is the response that Jack Smith says, is that if you were to accept this theory of immunity from criminal liability for a former president, essentially the president would be above the law for anything they did when in office, practically speaking.
Yeah, it's not a serious argument. I mean, if you take any defendant's behavior, whether they're the president or not, if you take it at a high level of abstraction, it sounds totally innocuous. It's like, oh yeah, we're just making phone calls, to fix prices, but that's like price fixing, we're just a bunch of phone calls or whatever. I mean, you can think, I prosecuted people who would manipulate the financial markets. Oh yeah, we're just trading, that's all we're doing is just buying and selling things. I mean, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, if you look at it at that level of abstraction.
Yeah. Like they're passing secrets to a foreign government. It's like, no, I'm just, consulting with other heads of state.
Right. No, it's like the guy in Catch a Predator. I just happen to be at this house. You know what I mean? I'm just showing up and walking. You know what I mean? I'm talking and walking. So yeah, I find some of that silly. I will just say, I mean, the original ruling, you can understand why Nixon versus Fitzgerald came out that way, because you don't want presidents, for example, when they're deciding whether to declare war or, to be worried about the potential civil lawsuit that comes from out of that, or pardoning someone is the person that they go out and kill somebody after they're pardoned. Does that mean you're going to have a civil lawsuit? You don't want presidents, worrying about getting sued all the time for what they're doing as president. I get that. But of course, what's happened here, and the real one of the challenges for Trump is somebody who's litigated a lot of motions to dismiss in the criminal context, is that at the motion to dismiss stage, the allegations in the indictment are presumed to be true, and the prosecutor drafts the indictment, and it always screws the defendant when they make these motion to dismiss claims, because the prosecutor is saying you did all these dastardly evil things. And unfortunately for Trump, Chutkan's going to look at this and say, look, none of this was, having some big scheme to defraud the United States was not part of your presidential powers. And so, yeah, you could say you were giving speeches, but people talk all the time and engage in fraud. It's not like FTX. Yes, TV commercials are free speech, but that doesn't mean that like committing fraud via TV commercial means that you're suddenly exempt from making fraud, engaging in fraud or the fraud statute. So I don't think that she's going to take it very seriously, and I also think that the United States Supreme Court's not going to take it very seriously, despite the makeup of the court. And I understand that Trump appointed 3 of the justices and so on. But I find it hard to believe that the United States Supreme Court is going to really say that essentially any crime committed by the president, as long as you can tie it in some way to his duties, that is immune, that's going to be immune from prosecution. That seems hard.
I 100% think Thomas for sure will buy into that theory. I guarantee you. Just because, and because he just has, as far as I can tell, an unlimited view of presidential power. I have not seen anything from his opinions that have limited what the president can do. I suspect that Alito might get on board too, because he's just cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs too. Well, first of all, let's just be clear here. This is a new question. This is a new legal question because we actually haven't tested it. Okay. Sure. So we don't have a lot to go on because, the president occupies a very specific place, and you don't know if criminal laws apply to him until he's charged with them. And we just haven't, fortunately, had the opportunity to do that before.
Correct.
But this theory, if it were to be accepted, would basically mean that for sure Mueller's conclusions could never be, we passed the statute of limitations now, but let's assume that we could never have been acted upon. In other words, if you can make this arguably firing, your FBI director certainly falls in some outer perimeter of presidential authority, right? Yeah. And if you're not allowed to look into the motive behind it, what would make that a criminal act, what would make that obstruction of justice would precisely rest on whether he acted with corrupt intent.
What if the president takes a bribe? Is that prosecutable under the Trump theory? In other words, I take a bribe in exchange for giving a pardon. Well, a pardon is an official act.
Correct.
getting money is on its face innocuous. You can't look at my motive for accepting this cash award. All you can look at is the act. Cashing a check is not illegal in and of itself, and pardon is a presidential power. So is bribery, not prosecutable if it's the president of the United States.
Right. You would end up with some very absurd results. And I think the question is there something about criminal liability that makes it different and less susceptible to abuse than the civil context? And there are many more procedural hurdles that you have to overcome to pursue a criminal case, right? Like you have to get a grand jury to indict. You have to meet a higher burden of proof. It's not the same kind of thing as a lawsuit, which, anyone can slap somebody with a lawsuit and basically create, a vexatious claim for the purpose of harassing or just generating some type of bad publicity or something. I mean, it's harder to do that in the criminal context. So there are natural protections for a former president in that way, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I do think criminal prosecutors have so much power that it is sadly easy for them to abuse that power. But in terms of actually bringing an indictment,
not against the president. Come on.
Well, I was going to say, first of all, bringing in indictments, one thing too. I mean, in other words, there are lots of ways that prosecutors in soft ways and grayish ways, not black and white, can use their power and misuse it and abuse it. But yeah, in terms of bringing an indictment, I think that's right. And there are procedural protections afforded. And I also just think that having that you can't have that sort of absolute bar that you have in the civil context. Now, in the civil context, basically what they're saying is, I'm sure if we gave some truth serum to the justices in 1982, they'd say, look, are there potential cases where maybe it does make sense for the president to, have some liability? Maybe. But it's just better to have this rule so the president's not focused on that, and the president's focused on like lawsuits, but is focused on getting the job done for the United States of America. And it could be that if there could be some tricky set of facts that might change that, right? Where a court could potentially sharpen that analysis. But in the criminal context, it's just anything that is plausibly charged as a crime, indicted as a crime, is going to be something that's so highly problematic and evil that it's very challenging to see the public policy reason why having a president focus on his or her duties is, means that we shouldn't, that we should basically exempt them from punishment for committing criminal activity.
Yeah, and I think that even under Trump's theory, that the specific charges in this particular case still fail. Even if you were to look at some outer perimeter of Article 2 duties or powers, what are the charges here? One is obstructing Congress. Like, right. Obviously, Article 2 authority stops where another branch's authority begins. So if the charge is that you've basically tried to prevent another branch from fulfilling their function, that is by definition not in the periphery. It is well beyond the bounds of your own branch's authority, I would argue. The other thing is that the president's powers are subject to limitations elsewhere in the Constitution, including people's individual rights. And one of the charges is a deprivation of rights. In other words, your Article 2 authority, again, stops where an individual's right to vote begins, right? And one of the charges here is that his actions were essentially an attempt to deprive the people of having their vote counted. And I think the fraud case is also, the situation is also applicable here. That gets more into that motive question. And is less, I think, obvious, but I don't know. If a president was giving a speech, it was like, everybody send me your credit card numbers and passwords, and that was the speech, and then he used that to, like, engage in, like, massive identity theft. I don't think you could then be like, Well, he was just giving a speech, and that's what presidents do.
Well, that's what I said. The allegations matter, and that's the problem. It's going to be very easy for Chutkan to sort of swat this down because she has to accept the allegations as true. And if you believe the way it's written by Smith, obviously it paints a grim picture on all of these counts, right? It's written by the prosecutor to basically lay out how, his theory of how crime occurred, right? So very, very challenging. Yes, the defense has some explanation for a whole different explanation for everything, and that's fascinating and all. But I've been there on both sides of it, and I'll just say when I was a prosecutor, I went up against a big Wall Street law firm that had great ideas of all these hypothetical people that the statute would be unconstitutional as applied to, but they're not this guy who got these very specific allegations that I wrote that painted him out to be very evil. So that the problem is they're not dealing with this hypothetical president on West Wing. They're dealing with the guy in this indictment, and that's the problem for this motion.
Yes. I'm not worried about Chutkan. I really am worried about the appeal from Chutkan. I think undoubtedly she's going to deny the motion to dismiss, but then this would be subject to appeal. It's a legal issue, right? Obviously, it's a very threshold legal issue, and I think that potentially creates delay, especially if it's going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. And while I share your general optimism that even the Supreme Court, as it's currently constituted, would not go along with this theory, I really don't know.
So wait, I'm confused. Are you the sad panda of this episode, Asha? Is that what you're telling me?
I think I'm cautious panda.
Wow. Okay.
I'm circumspect panda. Yeah.
Okay. I hear what you're saying. I'm gonna change my usual role here. I'm pretty optimistic about this. I wouldn't be concerned about the DC Circuit at all. I think DC Circuit en banc's gonna affirm Chutkan's ruling on this, and then when you go to the Supreme Court, it's just very hard for me to believe Supreme Court justices are gonna endorse anything this maximal. I think I could imagine some sort of split ruling where they're like, well, in certain circumstances, maybe, they provide immunity in certain limited circumstances, but on these facts, yada, yada, yada. Something along those lines, maybe. I just don't see them giving him a carte blanche here.
Hopefully, maybe on at least on a very narrow level, confined to these charges, as I said, as exceeding the scope of his Article 2 authority.
Remember, we had an issue with that Lazar's subpoena and all of that, right? Where it's like, oh, I have absolute immunity there. And ultimately, the Supreme Court, it was like a split decision and didn't quite they didn't give everything. But at the end of the day, you've got to produce the records to Congress. And I think at the end of the day, I just don't see the United States Supreme Court saying, whether we don't know whether it's true or not, there's still a trial. He's presumed innocent, yada, yada. But he's alleged to have done all these dastardly, heinous things that we think that that's totally fine. And if somebody's charged with that, they have complete and absolute immunity. Like I refuse to believe that that's the United States of America we live in right now.
So before we go, you and I both love trashy dating shows.
True.
And I want to know, are you watching The Golden Bachelor?
Okay. I know what Bachelor is. I've watched seasons of The Bachelor. Golden Bachelor, that's like, it's
Senior Bachelor.
Oh, like some old dude is The Bachelor?
He actually, he's quite, sprightly, I would say.
How old is he?
I don't know, maybe 70, I think. He looks young. He looks quite young. He's very active, has a youthful glow about him. He's actually, his story is sad. His wife, the love of his life, his high school sweetheart, I believe, died of cancer or died of an illness like 8 years ago, and he hasn't moved on since then. And so I guess his kids found a way to get him on Golden Bachelor. So he's there, and
why isn't it Silver Bachelor? Wouldn't that make more sense? Like silver haired, right? I don't know. Okay. Like Centrum Silver is
Yeah,
for the silver. Okay. Never mind.
But I guess it's golden years.
Okay. It's like Golden Girls,
I don't
Golden
know.
Bachelor. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Golden Girls. Exactly. So basically, then you have like the Golden Girls, like as the women who are competing.
And they're all in their 70s too.
They're literally all in their 70s. And
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. I mean, this actually,
They had a pickle.
it seems more wholesome than regular Bachelor.
It's actually much more wholesome.
Yeah, because the regular Bachelor is
They,
like some guy
like-
hooking up with 4 women at the same time, and they're all pretending like they're not like in their mind thinking about the fact that like, yeah, this guy said all the same stuff to some other woman like yesterday.
Oh, that's all happening though. That is still all happening.
Oh, okay.
The Golden Bachelor is a playa.
Oh, wow.
He is literally kissing everybody, left and right.
Well, kissing. Okay. Okay.
Well, he was in a hot tub.
Oh.
I mean, I'm just saying, there's some, action going on, but
Slow motion though.
And then they had like a pickleball tournament, and
Wow.
it got very competitive among the women, and there's been some cattiness. But here's the thing that I can't deal with is that for me, it's one thing to watch a bunch of 20-somethings get rejected and go home because you're like, whatever, like you're gonna be fine, you're gonna
Sure.
launch some reality career, you're gonna get a lot of dates or whatever. But like so many of these women are like similarly like they're widows, or this is like the first time they've really liked someone, in years and years, or they've been single for 22 years, and I don't know, like it's really, for me, it's a little sad.
Wow.
And even cruel to watch them get rejected.
Okay. I guess, honestly, the thing that makes me feel sad is it makes me worry that I'm getting old, because does this mean that the only people that watch The Bachelor are in the old age range? And so if we're a Bachelor fan, like they're aging up The Bachelor to match the target audience, which is like you and me. Is that the idea that we can't relate to the 20-somethings anymore? So we have the senior
It
Bachelor?
might be because you know who they had come back in the last episode was the first Bachelorette, Trista, who was from 20 years ago. By the way, she looks exactly the same.
Wow. Okay. Good for her.
Yeah, she does. She looks very good. But she came back and she was like, yeah, I was on The Bachelorette 20 years ago. And I was like, oh my God.
Wow.
We're old.
That's for dang sure.
Because I remember her.
Oh, yeah. I remember that first. Remember when he chose the other chick over her? The blonde?
Oh, I don't remember the drama.
Was her name Amanda? Trista got rejected at the end of the first season of The Bachelor. She was the runner-up on the first season of The Bachelor.
Oh.
So first season of The
and that's how
Bachelor,
she
there's
became
this
the
other
Bachelorette.
woman who got chosen over her, and it was very sketch, and most people thought Trista should have been the choice. And so that's how they spawned The Bachelorette, is they took Trista and they...
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's my recap of the dating shows. At some point, we should talk about The Apprentice. I don't know if you ever watched that.
I did watch
But
The
we'll have to
Apprentice.
save that for another. I watched The Apprentice. all
including
the time.
Celebrity Apprentice. So
I never watched Celebrity.
Celebrity Apprentice was great. Okay, we'll talk about that next time.
MSW Media.